Hey everyone, and welcome back. Today we're going to be tackling a pretty big question, one that I know a lot of you have probably thought about at some point. What does the Bible actually say about cremation? And does it affect a Christian's hope for resurrection?
Yeah, it's a question that comes up a lot. And it's not just, some theoretical debate. It's something that a lot of people really wrestle with when they're making decisions about, like, end-of-life care for themselves or their loved ones.
Absolutely. It's definitely a topic with a lot of different angles, so we're going to be looking at the theology, of course, but also the cultural aspects, environmental, even emotional, kind of the whole picture.
Yeah, exactly.
So to get us started, maybe we can just kind of lay the groundwork a little bit. What exactly is cremation?
Okay, so basically, cremation is when you use really high heat to reduce a body to ashes. And this all happens in a special chamber. It's called a retort.
A retort, huh?
Yeah. And the temperatures in there can get, like, crazy high. We're talking over 1,600 degrees Fahrenheit.
Wow, that's intense.
Oh, yeah, it is. And before they even start the process, they have to remove any metal objects, so things like, jewelry or anything like that. And then what's left is basically reduced to bone fragments. And then those are ground to the ashes that I know people are familiar with.
Okay, so that's the process itself, but now turning to the Bible, it doesn't actually ever directly mention cremation, right?
No, not specifically, but there are definitely passages that talk about what happens to the body after death. And those are, open to interpretation.
Right, so how do we approach those passages?
Well, one that often comes up is in Genesis chapter 3, verse 19, where it says, "For dust you are, and to dust you shall return."
Yeah, I remember that one.
And some people see that as supporting, the idea of both natural decomposition and cremation, because ultimately the body is returning to the earth.
That's an interesting point. And then there's all this symbolism of fire in the Bible, which seems pretty complex.
It is. Fire has this, like, dual nature in the Bible. It's seen as destructive, but also purifying. Like, think of the burning bush. It's totally engulfed in flames, but it's not consumed.
Yeah, that's a powerful image.
It is. And then there's the story of Elijah, where fire consumes his sacrifice, which is like a sign of God's acceptance.
So fire as God's presence and a purifying force, that kind of adds a whole new layer to thinking about cremations, doesn't it?
Yeah, definitely. And it's important to remember that the Bible focuses a lot on burial, but it never actually forbids cremation. It seems like a lot of the practices around burial were just influenced by the culture and the traditions of the time.
Okay, so I think this is probably on a lot of people's minds. If cremation is an option, does that somehow change the promise of resurrection for Christians?
That's the big question, right? And Christian theology teaches that God can restore anybody no matter what state it's in after death.
So even if a body has been cremated,
Yes. Like, if you think about what Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 15, he talks about how these mortal bodies are going to be transformed into glorious, incorruptible bodies. He doesn't say anything about needing a perfectly preserved physical body for that to happen.
okay, that's helpful. So it's not about the physical preservation of the body, it's about faith.
Exactly. It's about believing in God's power to do what seems impossible to us. Like, think about it this way. Paul says the resurrection body is going to be powerful, immortal. It's like your earthly body is the seed, and the resurrection is the blossoming of something totally new.
That's a beautiful way to think about it. So it's not about the physical method, but about faith in Christ.
That's it.
Okay, that makes sense. But let's say someone's considering cremation. What are some of the things that they should be thinking about? It's a big decision, after all.
Yeah, it is. I think the first thing is to consider what your own church or denomination teaches about cremation. Steve have, different viewpoints on it. So talking to your pastor or religious leader is probably a good first step.
Yeah, you want to be sure you're in line with your faith community beliefs.
Right. And then there's also, just the personal spiritual side of things. Like, does cremation sit right with your own beliefs and values? What kind of meaning do you attach to it?
It's definitely a time for some serious introspection.
For sure. And then, of course, family traditions play a big role, too. Some families have very strong traditions of burial, while others might be more open to cremation. It's always a good idea to have those conversations with your family just to make sure everyone's on the same page.
Yeah, those are hard conversations to have sometimes, but they're important.
They are. And then, there's the practical stuff, too. We all know traditional burial can be really expensive these days.
That's true. Funerals could be a huge financial burden. And that's one reason why cremation is often seen as a more affordable option for a lot of families.
Yeah, especially when finances are tight, it can make a big difference. And then there's also the growing concern about the environment, traditional burial with all the land that it takes up and the embalming fluids and
And those caskets, they take forever to decompose. I mean, it's no wonder that cremation is often seen as a more a more environmentally friendly choice.
Right. You're using less land, you're using fewer chemicals. It just makes sense for a lot of people.
Okay, so we've got all these different things to think about, the theology, the family traditions, the practicalities. I'm particularly interested in, these theological implications we've been talking about. There's a lot to unpack there.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Like, one thing that's really interesting is how we balance that idea of reverence for the body as the temple of the Holy Spirit.
Right, because the Bible's very clear on that our bodies are sacred.
Absolutely. But remember, there's nothing in the Bible that actually condemns cremation. And that kind of opens the door for different interpretations, different ways of approaching this as our culture changes.
That makes sense. It's not about the method itself, but about the respect behind it.
Yeah, exactly. Like, if someone chooses cremation, what really matters is that it's done with dignity and respect.
That makes a lot of sense. Now, you mentioned purification rituals earlier. Can you talk a little more about those and how they might relate to this?
Oh, yeah. So in the Book of Numbers, there are all these rituals for how to handle, mortal remains. And they emphasize this, like, deep reverence and respect for the body. And that same reverence should be there whether you choose cremation or burial.
I see what you mean. So it's about approaching the whole process with the right attitude, right? Not just seeing cremation as, destroying the body, but as a way of honoring the person and the sacredness of life, even in death.
Exactly.
Okay, that's really helpful. But I bet some people are still thinking, okay, even if it's not against the Bible, doesn't cremation, like, interfere with the resurrection somehow? How can we address that concern?
I think we need to remember what Christian theology is really saying about the resurrection. It's not about physically, like, reassembling our bodies.
You're right, it's about a transformation. Paul, in 1 Corinthians 15, describes this incredible change into a glorious body that's free from all the limitations we experience here.
Yeah, it's a spiritual body, it's incorruptible, it's powerful, it goes way beyond our current understanding of what a physical form can be. So cremation doesn't actually stop God from restoring and glorifying the body.
So it's not about trying to preserve the body perfectly so that, it can be resurrected.
No, not at all. God's power is so much bigger than that. It's not limited by what happens to the physical body after death.
Wow, that's powerful. It really comes back to faith, doesn't it? Trusting in God's power to do what we can't even imagine.
Exactly.
That brings us to another important concept, God's sovereignty. Can you explain a little bit what that means in this context?
Sure. So God's sovereignty basically means his power is unlimited. It goes beyond any physical or natural barrier we can think of.
So God isn't bound by how we choose to deal with death, whether it's burial or cremation.
Right. Think about 1 Thessalonians 4. It talks about the resurrection of everyone who's in Christ, both the living and the dead. It doesn't say anything about what state their bodies are in.
So God can restore anybody, whether it's been buried, cremated, lost at sea, anything.
Precisely. There's no limit to God's power.
That's incredible. It really changes how we think about choosing cremation or burial. It's not about trying to control the process to guarantee resurrection.
It's more about understanding that God is at work no matter what.
And that brings us to freedom of choice.
Right. It's like once you understand God's sovereignty, it takes away so much of the anxiety around all these earthly concerns. You don't have to worry about making the right choice between cremation and burial.
So it's more about making a choice that aligns with your beliefs, your values, your circumstances, and just trusting that God is in control.
Exactly.
That's really liberating. But even with all this talk about God's power and the promise of resurrection, we can't ignore the very real emotional impact cremation can have on families. Such a sensitive topic.
It is, and people grieve in different ways. Some people find a lot of comfort in those traditional burial rituals. They need that visual of the casket, the permanence of a grave.
Yeah, for some, it's a tangible way to process their grief, to say goodbye.
Right, but for others, cremation might just feel more right for them. Maybe they want to keep the ashes in an urn or scatter them in a place that was special to the person who died. Or even, have some of the ashes turned into jewelry.
It's about finding what brings comfort and helps them to heal. And there's no right or wrong answer, is there?
Absolutely not. And that's why it's so important to have honest conversations within families.
Because these decisions can be so emotionally charged, especially if the person who died didn't leave any clear instructions.
Right. Talking about these things beforehand can prevent a lot of arguments and misunderstandings later when everyone's already grieving.
Good point. So whether it's burial or cremation, the focus should really be on honoring the person who died and supporting the people they left behind.
Beautifully said.
Now, we can't talk about this topic without considering the environmental impact of our choices. Right?
Yeah, and that's definitely become a big part of the conversation around death and dying these days. Cremation is often seen as a more sustainable option compared to traditional burial. I mean, think about it. Overcrowded cemeteries, all the embalming fluids.
It's a lot. And cremation definitely has a smaller impact, right?
Yeah, but it's not perfect either. I mean, it still takes energy to cremate our body, and there are carbon emissions to think about. And then some people are exploring other options, like biodegradable coffins or natural burial grounds where they don't use any embalming fluids or concrete vaults.
It's interesting to see how our care for the environment is shaping how we think about these things, even when it comes to death.
It really is. It shows that we're starting to understand that our connection to the natural world doesn't end when we die.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here, looking at both the theological and the practical side of cremation. For our listeners, what would you say are the key takeaways for this first part of our deep dive?
Well, I think the most important thing to remember is that God's power is bigger than any physical limitations. The promise of resurrection isn't about preserving the body perfectly. It's rooted in faith. Whether you choose cremation or burial, it doesn't change God's power to do what he promised.
So it's not about the method, but about faith. That's really empowering, isn't it?
It is, and it gives us freedom to make the choice that feels right for us, our families, and our beliefs. And that can be a real comfort in a time of loss.
I agree. So as we wrap up this first part of our deep dive into cremation and Christianity, what would you say to those listeners who are still struggling with this question?
I would say take some time to reflect on what we've talked about, pray about it, and talk to your loved ones and your pastor or religious leader, get their perspectives.
That's good advice. It's a deeply personal decision with both spiritual and practical implications. We'll be back in part 2 to dig even deeper into the theological side of things, particularly the idea of cremation and resurrection. Until then, thanks for joining us.
See you next time. Welcome back, everyone. It's great to be continuing this conversation with you.
Yeah, I'm glad we're spending some more time on this because there's a lot to think about when it comes to cremation and, how it fits with Christian beliefs.
Definitely. There are a lot of nuances. So maybe we can pick up where we left off and kind of dive a little deeper into some of the theological ideas we were touching on.
Okay, yeah, that sounds good. One thing that keeps coming up for me is this whole idea of the body as the temple of the Holy Spirit. How does that, how does that fit in with the idea of cremation? It's something I know a lot of Christians think about.
It's a great question. And, it really gets to the heart of how we understand the relationship between our physical bodies and our spiritual selves. Like, what does it mean to say our bodies are sacred?
Right, because Paul's really clear about it in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 19. Your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit.
Exactly. And that's, a powerful statement. It has big implications for how we think about our bodies, both in life and in death.
So if cremation is essentially destroying the physical body, does that create some kind of conflict with this idea of the body being sacred?
I think this is where we have to move beyond just a literal interpretation and think about the deeper theological meaning. When we talk about the body as a temple, we're recognizing the inherent dignity and worth of each person created in God's image. It's not just about clinging to the physical form itself.
So even though our physical bodies return to dust, whether through decomposition or cremation, what really matters is how we treat the body.
Exactly. It's about the reverence and respect regardless of the method.
It goes back to that intention behind it.
Right. It's about honoring the person, acknowledging the sacredness of life, even as we face death.
And this is where the symbolism of fire that we talked about earlier gets so interesting. Fire has this dual nature. It's both destructive and purifying.
Yeah, that duality is really important.
So while some people might see fire as only destructive and not compatible with this reverence for the body, others might see it as this purifying element.
And there's a long history of connecting fire with rituals of purification in different cultures and religions.
Yeah, like the burning bush, completely engulfed in flames but not consumed. Or the Old Testament sacrifices, consumed by fire is a sign of God's acceptance.
Powerful images. They connect fire to something spiritual, a transformation that transcends just the physical realm.
So could we see fire in the context of cremation as a symbol of, releasing the soul from the body?
That's one way to interpret it. And it resonates with a lot of people who choose cremation. It's not about, disrespecting the body, but about a transition, a release.
That's a beautiful way to think about it. And it's interesting because, historically, some cultures practice cremation to actually protect the body from being desiccated.
That's right. They saw it as a way to safeguard the body, even in death.
So even though burial became the dominant practice for Christians, influenced by Jesus's burial and the belief in resurrection cremation, wasn't always seen as this negative thing or incompatible with faith.
Yeah, and as we said, the Bible itself doesn't condemn cremation. It's just not explicitly mentioned.
Which leaves room for different interpretations and for adapting to different cultural contexts and personal beliefs.
Exactly. And that's what we're seeing today as people weigh those ethical and environmental and financial aspects of how we handle death and burial.
But even with all that, some people still worry that cremation somehow interferes with resurrection. Like, how can God resurrect a body that's been turned to ashes? What would you say to that from a theological perspective?
I think it comes back to understanding what Christianity teaches about the resurrection itself. It's not about physically rebuilding our bodies, like putting all the pieces back together. Paul makes that really clear in 1 Corinthians 15.
Right, he's talking about a transformation into a glorious body, something we can't even fully comprehend right now.
It's a spiritual body, incorruptible, powerful. It goes way beyond our current understanding of physical form. So cremation doesn't actually stop God from being able to restore and glorify the body.
Okay, so it's not about trying to preserve the body in a certain way to make sure that, resurrection can happen?
No, not at all. God's power isn't limited by that. It's not limited by, what happens to the physical body after death.
Wow, that's really reassuring. It shifts the focus, away from this anxiety about the physical part of death and towards the promise of this new glorious existence.
It does, and it allows us to approach this whole question of burial versus cremation with a lot more freedom and peace.
Because it's not about trying to control the process to guarantee resurrection. It's about trusting in God's power and his plan.
Beautifully said.
And that brings us back to this idea of God's sovereignty. How does that fit into this conversation?
Well, God's sovereignty means his power is absolute. It's unlimited. It covers everything in creation, including life and death.
So God isn't limited by our human ways of dealing with death.
Right. God's plan is so much bigger than we can even imagine. And the resurrection is the ultimate proof of that. It reminds us that God is always working, even in the midst of what we see as loss or destruction.
So even if we have, questions or anxieties about what happens to our bodies, we can have peace knowing that God is in control.
Absolutely. And that understanding can bring so much comfort, especially when we're making these really difficult decisions about, end of life care or funeral arrangements.
It gives us this freedom of choice that can be so liberating. We don't have to be trapped by fear or worry about making the right decision.
Because in the end, our choices don't determine the outcome. It's God's power that brings about the resurrection.
Wow, that's powerful. It really challenges us to think differently about death.
It does. If we really believe in the resurrection, death isn't the end. It's a transition, a passage into a new way of being.
And that understanding changes everything about how we live our lives in the present, doesn't it?
Absolutely. When we're not consumed by this fear of death, we're free to really live, to love deeply, to make a difference in the world.
Because what matters most is how we live, not how we die.
Well said.
Okay, so we've talked about the theological implications, the symbolism of fire, God's sovereignty. But we also need to acknowledge the very real emotional impact cremation can have on families. It's a sensitive topic for a lot of people.
It is, and I think we need to approach this with a lot of sensitivity and compassion. The theological arguments might make sense, but grace is complicated. Everyone experiences it differently.
For sure, some people, they find comfort in those traditional burial rituals. They need that visual of the casket being lowered into the ground. They need that permanence of a grave.
It's a very tangible way to process that loss, to say goodbye.
Yeah, but for others, cremation just feels more right. Maybe they want to keep the ashes in an urn or scatter them somewhere meaningful or even have them made into jewelry.
And those are all valid ways to grieve, to remember. It's about finding what brings comfort and helps with the healing process.
Exactly. And there's no one right way to do that.
Absolutely not. And that's why open and honest communication within families is so important.
Because these decisions can be so emotional, especially if the person who died didn't leave any clear instructions about what they wanted.
It's true. Talking about these things beforehand can prevent so much misunderstanding and conflict later on when everyone's already hurting.
That's such a good point. So whether it's burial or cremation, the focus should really be on honoring the person who died and supporting the people they left behind.
I love that.
We also can't talk about all this without considering the environmental impact of our choices.
That's become such an important part of the conversation. And, cremation is often presented as a more sustainable alternative to traditional burial with all the issues of overcrowded cemeteries and embalming fluids and all of that.
Right, but even cremation has its downsides environmentally, right?
Of course. I mean, it takes energy to cremate a body. There are carbon emissions to think about. And that's why we're seeing people explore other options too. Things like biodegradable coffins or natural burial grounds that avoid using embalming fluids in those concrete vaults.
It's really encouraging to see how our responsibility to care for the environment is becoming part of how we think about funerals and how we deal with death.
It is. It shows a growing awareness that we're connected to the natural world even in death.
So as we kind of move toward wrapping up this deep dive into cremation and Christianity is there a simple answer to this question? Is it one or the other?
No, I don't think so. It's a decision that involves really thinking through, your own beliefs, your values, family traditions, the environmental impact, even your finances.
It's a personal choice.
It is, and it's one that's best made with a lot of prayerful consideration, seeking guidance from the Bible, from your spiritual leaders, and from your loved ones.
But what's most important is approaching this conversation with an open mind and a compassionate heart.
Absolutely. No matter what we choose, we're all united by that hope of the resurrection, that promise of a new life beyond anything we can imagine here.
And that's a message of hope and comfort, no matter how we choose to honor the bodies of those we love.
So well said.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground in this second part of our deep dive. Are you ready to move on to the final part?
I am. We'll be looking at some of the historical and cultural context around cremation, and also, this growing trend of eco-friendly burial practices.
It sounds fascinating. Stay tuned, everyone, for the third and final part of our deep dive into cremation and Christianity. All right, welcome back to the show, everyone. We're on the final part of our deep dive into cremation and Christianity, and I'm really curious to see where we land on this whole topic.
It's been a really fascinating conversation so far. We've covered so much, the theology, the symbolism, the emotional side, the environmental concerns.
Absolutely. So now we're going to shift gears a little bit and look at the history and cultural context that have kind of shaped how we view cremation today. I was actually surprised to learn that cremation has a much longer history than I realized.
Oh yeah, it goes way back. It's not a new thing at all. People have been practicing cremation for like thousands of years in different cultures all over the world.
Wow, I really had no idea. Like, where did it start?
Well, it was common in ancient Greece, ancient Rome, even in parts of the ancient Near East. Like, it was a pretty widespread practice.
So what changed? I mean, how did burial become so dominant, at least in the West?
Well, a few things happened. The rise of Christianity obviously had a huge impact.
Because of the emphasis on the resurrection of the body?
Exactly. Early Christian, they adopted burial as their way of laying the dead to rest. And that was probably influenced by, how Jesus was buried and the belief that the body would be raised up on the last day.
Right, right. And that practice just became really, really deeply ingrained in Christian tradition.
It did. And then, over the centuries, you had the development of all these elaborate burial rituals and the creation of cemeteries as sacred spaces. So it all kind of reinforced that idea that burial was the proper way to handle death.
So for centuries, burial was seen as like the only real option for Christians.
Pretty much, yeah. But even within the Bible itself, there are a few instances where cremation was practiced, especially in times of war or plague.
Oh, that's right. Like the story of King Saul and his sons in the book of 1 Samuel, they were cremated after they were killed in battle.
Yeah, exactly. That's a good example. And it shows that even in ancient Israel, cremation wasn't always seen as, this taboo or forbidden thing. Sometimes it was just practical. It was necessary.
So this idea that cremation is like inherently unchristian, it's a relatively new idea then.
Yeah, it seems that way. And it probably has to do with how some branches of Christianity started to really focus on the physical resurrection of the body.
But as we've discussed, the resurrection is ultimately about a spiritual transformation. It's not dependent on having a perfectly preserved physical body, right?
Right. And that opens up a much more nuanced view of cremation. We can look at the history, the cultural context, the practical considerations, the environmental concerns.
Which brings us to another really interesting development, the rise of eco-friendly burial options.
Yeah, this is a fascinating trend. As people become more aware of the environmental impact of traditional burial practices, they're looking for alternatives that are more sustainable.
And that includes cremation, but it also goes beyond that.
Right, we're seeing things like biodegradable coffins, natural burial grounds where they don't use embalming fluids or concrete vaults, even human composting where they basically return the body to the earth in a natural way.
Wow. It's amazing how innovation and this care for the environment are even changing how we approach death and dying.
It really is. It shows a growing awareness of our connection to the natural world, even in death.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into cremation and Christianity, it seems pretty clear that there's no one-size-fits-all answer here, right?
No, definitely not. It's a decision that each person has to make for themselves, taking into account their own beliefs, their values, their family traditions, their concerns about the environment, their financial situation even.
It's a deeply personal choice.
It is, and it's one that's best made with prayerful consideration, seeking guidance from the Bible, from your spiritual leaders, from your loved ones.
Yeah, it's about having those conversations, isn't it?
It is, and no matter what you choose, you're not alone. We're all united by that hope of the resurrection, that promise of a new life that goes beyond anything you can even imagine here on earth.
That's a beautiful thought to end on. It's a message of hope and comfort, no matter how we choose to honor the bodies of those we love.
Beautifully said.
Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive. It's been a really enlightening conversation for me, and I hope it has been for you too.
It has.
And to our listeners, we encourage you to keep exploring this topic, maybe even share your own thoughts and experiences in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you.
We would.
Until next time, keep seeking, keep learning, and keep diving deep.